And did the anti-war movement at home have any effect on these soldiers in creating a sense of what they were doing was wrong, that they were victims, they were making mistakes? Did that have impact, you think, on the soldiers?
There was a wide coffee house, GI coffee house movement. The anti-war movement tried to set up coffee houses near U.S. bases to promote literature and things. But honestly, when you read soldiers' memoirs and novels, they honestly don't talk about the anti-war movement very much. It's not to say there wasn't an influence, but they talk about reacting to the situation of warfare that they're in. The one that, the moral qualms are the moral qualms that are seen on the battlefield. The one clear influence of the anti-war movement is nobody wanted to be the last man to die in Vietnam. I mean, once it was stated that the U.S. was going to withdraw eventually, that made it more difficult.
There was one place in your book where you said that this actually was a class warfare that was going on, and that black soldiers were at the forefront of the fragging and the revolt.
Let's remember who went to Vietnam. After World War II, the U.S. military decided that too many college-educated men had been killed, and that the danger of this was that it was going to hurt the scientific base of the country. If the scientific base of the country was hurt, we couldn't have the next generation of weapons. So the idea of the 2S deferment, of the college deferment, was to keep the pool alive. What this meant was, remember, this is an era of very few student loans, very few scholarships, so on and so forth. It meant that the sons of the middle class could go to college, where the sons of the working class went to the military. In the military itself, military needs vast numbers of white-collar skills. So if you had any kind of like clerical skills, like middle-class people often do, typing, filing, so on, you could more readily get a non-combat job. What this translated into is that once you got down to the point of who was in your infantry units, your armor and artillery, they were disproportionately minorities and rural whites, poor rural whites, poor urban whites. So we had a working class, largely working class military, combat military, whereas a more middle class anti-war movement and a more middle class logistic apparatus in the military.
So it was a class revolt.
A class revolt. No, I wouldn't call it revolution. We're not talking about these people who are not socialists now. But it is sort of like, let's revolt against the manager, yes.
It's not in our interest. They're exploiting and using us.
Yes. Yeah, and it's certainly among black soldiers, they were definitely influenced by the Black Power movement. Racial consciousness and critical consciousness was very paramount. And there were many of the tie signs, of bonding signs of, you know, the skin and special handshake, so on and so forth.
How would you evaluate the mass media handling of Vietnam then and now?
I spent a long time looking at the tapes, and I was close. It's like I'd finished my outline. I was going to write a book about television news coverage of the war, and I decided to think, well, what was not on the news frame? What I saw, and that's consequently I wrote this other book, The Perfect War. What's on the news is a lot of pictures of helicopters, a lot of pictures of jets, a lot of pictures of tanks, a lot of hardware, in which techno-war was the major representation, too, visual representation. And along with these presentations of these beautiful weapons, I remember my favorite was an ABC show, an ABC series, where they first went out and they see the battleship New Jersey. Battleship New Jersey had just been recommissioned in '69, and we see here's this 16-inch guns, and there's this giant 30-foot phallus that the camera looks down, and the guy starts talking about it. Shoots a 250-pound projectile 16 miles. It'll go through 32 feet of reinforced concrete, or maybe I have it the other way. Maybe it's 32 miles, 16 feet of reinforced concrete. I forget, and it's a 250-yard kill radius. And it's simply like the man is the correspondent become a salesperson. And like I thought, gosh, I too want the battleship New Jersey, you know, this is just cool beyond belief. And then the film cuts, and there's another correspondent, and he's on the bank of a river, and it's about the VC flying trash can. And do you remember the Roadrunner rockets, you know, about Wiley Coyote was always getting something from ACME Rocket Company that always kind of looked like a trash can on a stick with a kind of like triangle on top of it? That's exactly what this rocket looked like. It was obviously of a homemade crude rocket. And the contrast is so great, and it seems like American victory is so ensured because of our technical superiority. Of course, what they don't point out, the Viet Cong who fires that rocket knows exactly what he's shooting at, was the battleship New Jersey very rarely knew where its bullets were flying.
So the media,
that's what the people saw. People saw that. People did not see very many dead people. There were very few. The death convention on the news was much like a war movie or westerns. No real gore. And they saw a body count each week, which showed that we were always winning. We saw one village was burned in 1965. That's it. And the guy correspondent got in severe trouble. My Lai appeared as remember, did not come from, the news of it didn't come from the normal networks. It came from a veteran who tried hard to get the news out. Very little coverage of massacres came on. The ordinary language of the war, gook, slope, slant, dink. No American news correspondent ever talked about those terms and what they meant. Never. It simply did not occur. Instead, it was very much an official perspective. Where one got critical, from '68 on, occasionally you would see reports about failed technology, and occasionally you would see stories about tragic American deaths. But it was sort of like a human interest tragedy becomes the limit of criticism rather than any kind of explanatory notion of why we aren't succeeding.
Bill, let's talk about an evaluation of the Vietnam War. A lot of people have written books about it, historians and generals, and et cetera.
Well, let's end it just to come back to where we started, to this other point. My analysis says the U.S. had to get out because we couldn't fight, because we had an army that wouldn't do it anymore. Now, you could move to Air Force campaigns, but Air Force campaigns have their problems, too. You can't hold ground with airplanes. Sending money to the South Vietnamese, they were corrupt. They just had more money to be corrupt with. So we were defeated. My analysis says the United States was defeated, and that's the standpoint. So the question is, how have the historians and the novelists, so on, treated the subject of American defeat? The conventional path is a liberal interpretation. That is, it's just a tragedy. It's just things were wrong out there somewhere, and it's just like there were all sorts of small mistakes of honorable men making small decisions.
Arthur Schlesinger being
Arthur Schlesinger would be the most famous, the classical case. Stanley Carnell's book and PBS series, the most recent example. But the notion of tragedy is not an explanation. 20 years of small mistakes doesn't explain a war that has a very clear structure, which is my argument, and if the structural contradictions of that mode of warfare ended in its dissolution and failure. The second school, the most prominent right now, is that the U.S. lost because of self-imposed restraints. Self-imposed restraints is a military term often used in Joint Chiefs of Staff documents calling for escalated air war. And their vision is that the United States should have invaded North Vietnam in 1966 and taken Hanoi and Haiphong. Of course, the only problem with that, every one of those peasants who had those guns shooting against the aircraft, the jet fighter pilots, they were also organized and prepared for invasion. And Doug, you mentioned you mentioned the fact that the North Vietnamese didn't have very many troops in the South. That was one of the major reasons. It wasn't that they didn't want to help their comrades and their Southern comrades. It was the troops were being held back in part to protect the home front against a possible American invasion. According to Giap, the plan to fight a U.S. invasion was to let local militia and regional forces fight for the first day to 2 days. So once the Americans were tired, after 24 to 48 hours of constant combat, then the North Vietnamese army would enter the scene. In other words, this notion that the U.S. could have had a successful invasion is just the most bizarre, unreal, fantasy, unworthy of any kind of serious consideration. And even if they had put an expeditionary force in Hanoi and Haiphong, that wouldn't change the class structure in South Vietnam. That wouldn't change the fact that you had a peasantry that wanted land, that you wanted Buddhists who wanted self-determination rather than Catholic rule, and that a whole country wanted national reunification because the whole basis of the culture was throwing out the foreign invader, and that's all they'd done all their lives for 2,000 years was throw out the Chinese, the French, and now the Americans. It wouldn't have changed it. The self-imposed restraint still is false.